Hello and welcome to this webinar called Digital Governance, a Jewish Perspective. This webinar is part of a campaign called #Delete Antisemitism, a campaign that just in time for the upcoming Digital Services Act of the European Commission aims to bring a Jewish perspective to digital governance. My name is Benjamin Fischer, and I work as program officer here at the Alfred Landecker Foundation, which is based in Berlin, and I'm responsible for its digital portfolio. This event was organized by a group of, well, I would say some of the most significant Jewish organizations, both in Europe and the world. Let me quickly run you through them. It is the American Jewish Committee Transatlantic Institute, Bnei Brit Europe, Bnei Brit International, SEGI, a Jewish contribution to an inclusive Europe, the European Jewish Congress, the European Union of Jewish Students, and last but certainly not least, the World Jewish Congress. And let me personally add, as someone who has spent more than 4 years in Brussels working with many of these organizations, I'm personally also extremely happy to be among friends and in such good company. Well, why are we here today? The corona pandemic might have acted as a flint to what we these days call a toxic online environment, but it certainly is not the very reason for why we face problems online. To be specific, problems with online hate. In 2018, the Fundamental Rights Agency conducted data about Jews living all over the continent, and more than 89% answered the question of whether and how online hate is a problem to them with yes. This significant number can not only be seen as, well, a problem itself, but it must act as a warning sign both for policymakers and platforms. At the same time, this debate takes place in a, let's say, framework where both policymakers and platforms are in a constant, well, I don't want to call it a vicious circle, but in a circular argumentation over who is responsible on these issues. Policymakers want to create new legislation. Platforms, well, on the one hand, try to operationalize these things, but on the other hand, also need to find ways on, let me be precise, asking questions of liability. In that sense, we do welcome wholeheartedly the announcement by Facebook, but also Twitter. We all still have them in mind that, for example, Holocaust denial will be deleted on the platforms, just to mention one of the most recent actions that were taken. The upcoming Digital Services Act in that context is a very unique chance for all stakeholders mentioned, but also for civil society at large. And that is why the Jewish community aims to voice, well, their claims, but also to take part in shaping what might become one of the most significant pieces of legislation shaping European online spheres. In that sense, let me repeat, if you're not watching over the website, please check deleteantisemitism.org and take a closer look also on the policy proposals that were posted there. Well, today we want to discuss in that sense what necessary measures have to be taken in order to curb online hate, and specifically online anti-Semitism. A pair of outstanding speakers have joined us on this matter. It's my great pleasure to introduce first and foremost Michela Palladino. She works as public policy manager for Facebook Europe, the Middle East and Africa. And then secondly, Mr. Dan Shefet, who is not only a very well-known expert on the matter, but he is advisor to UNESCO and the Council of Europe Internet Ombudsman. Before diving into the conversation, we are honored to also have with us here today the Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency, Madam Vice President Věra Jourová. Well, Madam Vice President, thank you so much for being with us here today, for taking the time. And without further ado, The floor is yours for keynote remarks.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad I can be with you through the technologies, which we are also going to speak in the webinar. Can you hear me well, please? Can I continue?
Yes, we can hear you properly, Madam Vice President. Thank you.
That's great. Technology works for us. Thank you very much. The topic of the webinar is a highly topical and very serious one, because we see very clearly now that online hate speech, violent extremism, and disinformation all have the potential to threaten the cohesion of our societies and cause harm to our democracies, to our communities, and to individual people. In recent years, we have witnessed a rise in hate speech and violent attacks directed at Jewish communities. The COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated the situation. A 30% increase of anti-Semitic hate speech this spring as compared to November 2019, as was reported by the World Jewish Congress, tell us clearly that we have to act and must step up our response. And we know anti-Semitism kills in Europe today. And the attack in Halle, commemorated on the 9th of October, was broadcast online. The online space was crucial in the radicalization path of the attacker and the dissemination of his hateful ideas. And worryingly, this is not an isolated case, but a modus operandi we have seen emerge across the globe, like just remember Christchurch. This is why we are taking action to protect our citizens online as we do so offline. Together with UNESCO, Twitter, and the World Jewish Congress, the Commission is implementing the Think Before Sharing campaign to combat online conspiracy theories, including those based on anti-Semitism. In 2016, I launched a voluntary code of conduct on countering illegal hate speech online, together with Facebook, Microsoft, YouTube, and Twitter. Over the years, many other companies have signed up to the code, including Instagram, Snapchat, and just last month, TikTok. And we have made significant progress. 90% of the notifications by users to review hate speech are now assessed within the 24 hours, which was demanded by the Commission, compared to 40% in 2016. The code has also strengthened cooperation between companies and civil society organizations, including in areas such as awareness raising and education. Extremist groups spread and are fueled by illegal hate speech. And we need to work together across sectors to better detect and address such online propaganda and disrupt the activities of hateful groups. This is why the EU Internet Forum is working on tackling right-wing terrorism and extremism online and aims to collect all groups and symbols banned under national laws for a comprehensive overview. Industry players themselves have recognized the importance of ensuring effective action against anti-Semitism, as shown by Facebook's recent decision to ban Holocaust denial. However, we cannot leave such important issues completely to voluntary actions, to self-regulation. It is crucial we ensure that illegal content is being removed while protecting fundamental rights online. The Digital Services Act will be an important opportunity to set a horizontal framework. We will clarify responsibilities, increase online accountability, and improve transparency. One of the main objectives of this instrument will be to improve users' safety online across the whole EU, while improving the protection of their fundamental rights. While it will not define illegality of content, it will provide a framework for member states to apply national and EU law in the online space. Hate speech is prohibited in all EU member states according to their criminal laws. So this is what we are going to do, to open the possibility, better possibility for the member states to apply their national and enforce, which is important word, enforce their national law in the online space. And member states, speaking now about EU legislation, can rely on the framework decision on racism and xenophobia that prohibits racist and xenophobic hate speech and hate crime, as well as public denial and distortion of the Holocaust, digitally or physically. We recognize that more work needs to be done. We cannot fight what we cannot define. So here comes the importance of the working definition of anti-Semitism by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is crucial to define what can be identified as anti-Semitic content and what cannot. 18 EU member states have already adopted the definition, which I think is a great progress. The Commission urges all others to move in the same direction, in line with the commitment made in the 2018 Council Declaration on the fight against anti-Semitism. This declaration was signed by the Ministers of Home Affairs, so ministers who are responsible for guaranteeing the security and safety for their citizens. On the 18th of September this year, the Commission has presented an ambitious anti-racism action plan which aims to recognize the impact of racism on daily life. This includes also, of course, the fight against online hate speech. Anti-Semitism is a cross-cutting problem. We need holistic approaches focusing on security, focusing also on education, Holocaust commemoration, and supporting Jewish life in Europe. And we need to better mainstream the fight against anti-Semitism across policy areas. In this respect, the Commission will prepare next year a dedicated strategy on combating anti-Semitism. But it will take joint efforts from all of us, European institutions, member states, businesses, Jewish organizations, and others, working together to ensure Jewish people can live their lives safely in the EU. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President, and also for allowing us to ask you a few more questions in order to get a more detailed thinking also of what the Commission's goals are with regard to the upcoming Digital Services Act. So let me dive right into it. President von der Leyen has promised a human-centered approach that puts the dignity and safety of users first. Now, how do you anticipate this being reflected in the Digital Services Act?
We are going to use this as a basic principle for everything we do around the technologies. And you could notice that the EU and the Commission is now intensively working on several other pieces of legislation, not only the Digital Services Act, but also on the rules for artificial intelligence. And we believe that Europe is well placed to come with meaningful regulation, which will put people, individual people and their fundamental rights in the center of it. We already did it with data protection, with protection of privacy, and this is exactly what we want to do and promote this principle in the Digital Services Act. We want to harmonize due diligence obligations for online platforms, including notice and action procedures for illegal content, and also redress mechanisms, accountability measures, and cooperation obligations with public authorities. We want to ensure greater transparency on how platforms moderate content, on advertising, and on algorithmic processes, which is directly connected with your question, because we want to know what's happening there. Digital world must not behave as a black box. This is a parallel world where the people moved to a large extent. They moved to virtual space where we have to move the legal framework and the rules as well, because what's happening in that so far rather black box than transparent space is directly influencing the daily life of the people. So human-centric approach, the respect for every individual, no mass handling. We want the people to be the users of the internet, not the easy to manipulate crowd and easy to radicalize crowd. So this is all in the center of our work. You will see the result. We will adopt the Digital Services Act next to the European Democracy Action Plan, which will focus on disinformation on the 2nd of December this year. And I think that it will be a big step forward, because we mean it seriously that in EU we want to see technologies and digital technologies especially in the service of the people, not vice versa.
Let us speak about results then, a bit more concrete. The issue with online hate being that, people face it in their everyday life when going through their timelines, thinking of, maybe what to shop or where to travel. So in that sense, it's an issue that is extremely present for its victims. With the ongoing debate between platforms and legislators about on who should be liable, to what extent can the Jewish community trust that this new piece of legislation will take an immediate effect in their everyday life? And maybe also, what role can they play in order to enforce and strengthen civil society's actions on this matter?
This is a very good question, because I always feel that, or sometimes feel that we prepare the rules top down, and we have to rely on and enhance also the activities bottom up, and the active civil society and active people who also are doing more to defend their own rights. And here comes the system we want to introduce by the Digital Services Act, which will be again partly dependent on the notifications, on the announcements of the organizations, but also of the individual people who might find themselves affected by hate speech online. There will be a push on the platform themselves to proactively detect such cases and act against them. We want to use more precise definitions of what is illegal content, but again, I want to stress, stemming from the national legislation, from the national criminal law. So the immediate effects should be seen, as well as it should be seen already now, because as I said to you, we started the Code of Conduct in 2016 to see immediate effect. I could not come in 2016 with a legislative proposal, which would have to go through lengthy legislative process. The EU legislation, especially the controversial one, and this is always controversial where we touch the content online, because we have to protect the freedom of expression also, and it's always controversial and raises a lot of discussion. So for such legislation, we would have to count with several years of legislative process, and in 2016 we needed to see immediate effect, and we saw quite good effect after, I think, half year, when we saw that around 70% of notified cases of hate speech were removed within 48 hours. Now it's quicker. I told you, now it's 90% within 24 hours. We do not want the platforms to remove everything, because not everything which is offensive, which is ridiculing people, is hate speech, which is prohibited by the law. We are not speaking here about ridiculing or about some satiric comments and so on. We speak about real or about digital or virtual violence, which has the potential to grow into physical violence. So we will continue now the Code of Conduct, and the system has to be better and more transparent. We are making improvements of it. We are inviting more platforms to join us. As I told you last month, it was TikTok, and others are considering, because we want to cover more than 90% of the single market or of the market in the EU. But at the same time, it's high time we come with the legislation, with the Digital Services Act, which will be adopted by the Commission in December, and then we'll follow the legislative process. And I cannot tell you when the legislation will come into force after being adopted by all three legislators. So we are now continuing the self-regulatory framework, and I want to encourage everyone who knows about the cases of hate speech targeted against the Jewish citizens. Notify it. Don't be passive. There are possibilities also to address the civil society organizations, the organizations which organize also this webinar. We must not be passive, because passivity is evil in itself, as well as the real actions.
Madam Vice President, as someone who has been working, who back then did work, in Brussels, I vividly remember the involvement of you personally, but also your office in the drafting process of the Code of Conduct. And let me at this point, therefore, also thank you for two things. First of all, for taking the time today and for providing us with such great food for thought in the ongoing debate. But then secondly, both looking back at what happened in 2016 and then again what is going on right now, for being at the forefront of this issue, for taking our concerns seriously, and for being, well, such a great force in shaping European digital spaces. So thank you very much for being here with us today, for your great remarks, and please stay healthy and all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I wish you fruitful discussion. Thank you, bye.
Thank you. So let's, at this point then, go back to our panel and use these thoughts that were just shared with us as a basis for the planned debate. Again, let me take this chance to welcome our two panelists, both Michaela and Dan. We are on first name basis as we agreed, so I will continuously address you as such. And let's maybe start more on a meta level and go from the more general to the more specific issues, since this is a debate that also requires some insight into the topic. Let's face it. Michaela, maybe could you briefly give us an overview of the actions that Facebook, in your case, as a platform, has been tackling hate speech, but what might also be very interesting for us, the evolution of the process in which Facebook dealt with this topic, because we can clearly see changes over time.
Sure. Can you hear me okay? I am muted myself, so it should work. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me and for giving me the opportunity of presenting Facebook approach to hate speech, and to hate speech also targeting Jewish individuals online on our platform. So let me start by saying that obviously hate speech is not allowed on Facebook. However, as a global company, have an approach to moderating speech online, which has to reflect the nature of the service that we provide, which is a service that we provide globally and to a large number of users. What we also know is that hate speech is very contextual. It depends on the cultural and the historical context of different countries, of different groups, of different ethnicities and different religions. So in order to achieve its objective of balancing freedom of expression and safety of its users, Facebook needs to start from this. So our approach to hate speech is, I would say, twofold. On one hand, we have illegal hate speech, which is the content that is deemed illegal by the different national legislations. And obviously Facebook respects the law. We have separate systems for receiving reports of locally illegal content, and we take action of that content if we consider that to be illegal after obvious legal assessment. And on the other hand, you have Facebook policies, what we call community standards, which are a global set of rules which apply to all of our users universally, or globally rather. So our community standards do not reflect any specific legal system because of what I explained before, the fact that Facebook as a global scale and serves a lot of different people from different nationalities with different backgrounds that have different sensitivities with regard to how speech affects them. Obviously, because our policies, much like legal systems and local law, are aimed at preventing harm, often there is an overlap, a natural overlap between what is covered by our community standards and what is covered by national law. However, our community standards, I just like to underline this, is separate from illegal content, doesn't exclusively cover illegal content. When it comes to hate speech, well, illegal hate speech, since we're talking about that. So as I said earlier, we do not allow hate speech on Facebook, and because we believe that it creates an environment of intimidation, exclusion, and in some cases it may lead to real world violence, to offline harm. For this reason, we have developed a definition of hate speech, which is attacks on individuals or groups based on a series of protected characteristics, which go from race, sex, gender, national origins, religious affiliation, etc. I also would like to add that our community standards are very broad, and they cover over 20 different behaviors that are deemed as not allowed on our platform. And our policies work very much in concert with one another. For example, and I'll use this example because it's very close to the topic of today, when it comes to anti-Semitism, our fight to it is just not in our hate speech, anti-hate speech policies, but it includes elements of other policies, like, for example, bullying, harassment, credible violence, but also, for example, dangerous organizations and individuals, which is a policy that very much looks at the behavior in the offline world as well, in addition to just the content that is being shared. And let me give you an example. When it comes to dangerous organizations and individual, when an individual is designated or an organization is designated as dangerous and effectively banned from Facebook, we do not allow that individual and that organization to have any place on the platform, which means that even if the objective of this person is to use Facebook profile to share pictures of their cat, that person will not have that visibility, will not have that opportunity. So I would try to move on because I don't know how much time I have, but obviously what makes our community standards important is the fact that we enforced against them. And the way that we enforce against our community standards, it's again in two directions. One is reactive and another one is proactive. So reactive, what we do is that we receive reports from our users, from our trusted partners, which are civil society organizations, etc., which have a dedicated channel, but also governments and law enforcement, and we receive those reports, we assess them, and then a decision is taken on the basis of that, whether to remove or keep the content online. And on the proactive side, instead, we obviously use artificial intelligence and automated tool to proactively surface specific content. And then this content is submitted for review, and then a decision is taken on the basis of that. We, however, make mistakes. We are very committed to evolving our approach to how we address hate speech and other abusive behaviors online. We have over 300 people within our staff, which is dedicated to researching how offenders operate on the platform and find ways to perfect our policies and system in order to respond to these abuses. And we also rely heavily on the expertise of academics and civil society organizations, which are very close to these topics. And we rely on them for advice. And as a result of these conversations, our policies very much evolve over time. And an example is what actually was mentioned by Commissioner Jourová, but also by you, Ben, earlier, is the evolution of our decisions with regard to harmful stereotypes, for example, which we announced in August this year. and basically expands our hate speech policies to include a ban on harmful stereotypes, like for example, the conspiracy theory that says that Jewish people are ruling the world. And then led to the decision, which was announced earlier this month, of banning Holocaust denial and distortion as well. So I think I'll stop here. But if you have any other questions,
right? I just wanted, no, this is perfect, Michaela. You just set a framework that I think is very important, because you touched on quite a few issues that we will later address during the discussion in more detail. But maybe to briefly summarize for us to understand, so you have community standards, they're being applied on an international level. National differences are being weighed where legislation is of manner. This was the case with Holocaust denial beforehand. Now it's an international issue, an international policy. We do understand that you have reactive and proactive tracking mechanisms. And at the same time, you're trying to constantly evolve. Some examples have been shown. We will speak about harmful stereotypes later. So thank you for this brief introduction, because really many of these issues will be addressed. I think the most important one here is the distinction between legal and illegal hate speech, but we'll speak about that later. Ben, it is my honor to now address you and also in person on this panel. And what would be interesting for us to understand is, so first of all, we are in a discussion where, you know, more than one platform was invited. Obviously, we will now go into detail about the policies of Facebook, but let's face it, Facebook might be the largest platforms, I have to say. Yeah, we speak of WhatsApp, Facebook, and Instagram in that context, but not necessarily the worst. So it's very important for us to also, you know, get insights on what's going out there at large. So with this being said, Dan, you are, as I said, a well-known specialist on the topic. In particular, you hold several offices that will be of importance to us, but let me maybe also give you the chance to start with a more brief meta intro. We spoke about how a platform reacted to the issue. Could you maybe tell us a bit about how the issue at hand evolved? Are there any worrying trends that you would address on this panel? Things that you think we should address in particular when it comes to the matter of hate speech online, and in particular anti-Semitism online?
Well, yes, thank you. I've been working in this space for probably over 10 years now. Yeah, I think it's about 10 years. I remember when I started working on content regulation, it amounted to censorship. I was the ugly and bad censor who was trying to kill free speech. And it's very, very interesting that over the years, that conversation has completely changed. Even with our friends in the US, everybody understands now that technology is not good and is not bad. It depends on the use you make of it. And unfortunately, a lot of abuse has been made of wonderful technology. And now we are in a situation where everybody agrees that the harmful impact can in no way be ignored. So this is where I come from. And I found the developments over these last 10 years extremely interesting, as I just mentioned. Let me say about Facebook, since we have Facebook with us, but I'll also speak about the other platforms. Michaela, I really found it very, very interesting to listen to you. And I must say that I don't envy your task, and I don't envy Facebook's task. I think that it's wonderful to see that over the past couple of years, Facebook has really faced a challenge, understood that with the enormous power it has accepted the responsibility. Not necessarily the legal responsibility, but the ethical, the moral, the societal, and so on. So kudos, I really appreciate it. It's a wonderful experience to see that you're really taking it seriously. Not only you, but Facebook at the highest level. Of course, when you do this, it was interesting that you mentioned in your summary that the community guidelines are international, and they probably have to be. And at the same time, you mentioned that there was some national legislation that had an impact, and you mentioned, for instance, the genocide denial, and which is illegal in many countries, and especially in Germany, and therefore was also illegal as far as Facebook was concerned in Germany, and now it's become a general policy. Of course, the problem is, and we're facing that right now in France, and I have to mention that, because I think everybody would be thinking about it anyway. The terrible, terrible, horrible attack that we saw last Friday on a school teacher being decapitated on the streets in a small town next to Paris. because of his attempt to teach children at school the importance of free speech. The reason that I'm mentioning this, and I think that we will be discussing afterwards what the implication of social media is in that tragic event. There was a meeting with the French ministry this morning, and there was also one yesterday. And I think that the French government is going to revisit the AVIA law in a new law that will probably be passed in a couple of months. And I'm also glad to develop that a bit further, a bit later. But what the point I want to make is that it is really extremely difficult for a company like Facebook to have a consistent policy as to where are the limits on free speech when it comes to religious questions. This is really a case at point which shows that having an international policy which is the same all over the world is probably impossible. So your task, which needs to take into consideration the local cultural difficulties, is humongous, but it is absolutely necessary. Another thing that I saw when I started working on this about 10 years ago was I asked the question, which is there really a correlation between hurtful content and hurtful behavior? Or is it just mythology? Now, do we actually behave in nefarious ways because we read nefarious stuff on the internet? And going back in recent history, this is actually a psychological question. It's a sociological question. It's a behavioral question. It's not a legal question. It's not a tech question either. Going back in recent history, we saw that question already with TV. We saw it with video games, just to give you a few examples. The debate was on then, and there was no consensus, and there still is no consensus as to whether violent video games cause children to be violent. There are just as many opinions about that as psychologists. So I needed to have some sort of comfort that in order to regulate the internet, including in particular social media, because when I regulate, I mathematically limit free speech. So I needed to have some sort of comfort that I was really doing this on the basis of some scientific evidence and not just on the basis of intuition. I don't know whether Facebook has done some internal studies on that, and I'd be very interested in maybe Facebook sharing that, to what extent there is such a correlation, to what extent Facebook, which has some of the finest behavioral psychologists in the world, of course, working on targeting advertising, and that's no critique. To what extent Facebook has, for instance, with the work of Dr. Fogg, who works now for Facebook at Stanford University and is one of the most important behavioral scientists in the world, shared his knowledge with Facebook as to the potential danger of content. Because in my opinion, it's much more important to regulate content which from a psychological point of view has the potential to affect behavior than some sort of contextual or semantic analysis that may between learned people arrive at the conclusion that this is illicit speech, but it has no effect. So I would actually talk about dangerous speech rather than illicit speech as the threshold of where companies like Facebook should actually take action. So do you know, Michaela, that Facebook has undertaken such scientific studies in-house?
Dan, let me thank you very much for overtaking there. And I love where this is going. This is why I specialized on debates on this very manner, because they tend to get a dynamic. But let's maybe also with regard to timing. First of all, I want to thank the two of you for your very comprehensive remarks as a beginning. The idea really was, for the opening question, to give you a chance to give us a broad overview of what it is that you are doing and where you think are the most pressing issues at hand. I think we can all agree that we wouldn't be here if this issue wasn't dear to us, or if we wouldn't want to, if it weren't for us, trying to somehow fight hate online. I think the question at hand is, how can we best do this, and who should do it? Should it be the platforms? Should it be the legislators? What role does civil society play? law enforcement, and so on. And this is why I'd like to, at this point, and again, sorry for cutting you there, Dan, we will go back to your question a bit later, but this is why I would now like to take it from a more general perspective to a more specific one. And again, these were your opening remarks. Please, let's from now on try to stick to a given, let's say 3 to 4 minutes, so that we can exactly do what just happened, which is, let the two of you interact on these pressing issues. Because Michaela, I can imagine you must have taken quite a few notes on things you need to answer to right now. So let me again try to make it a bit more specific. I've mentioned this number: 89% of the Jews living in Europe do answer the question of whether anti-Semitism online plays a significant role in their everyday life with a yes. This is not only a warning sign, but it should serve as a more than a recommendation, even as a North Star for policymakers in that field. So that is why we are speaking about this campaign, deleting anti-Semitism. And as part of that campaign, the organizations at hand have formulated quite a few policy recommendations, in total 10. And what I'd like to do at this point is to go from that meta level through each and every policy recommendation, because you will see that all the issues that you've touched upon will reappear as we are doing this. So let's start with the very first one. And maybe Dan, this time it would be great to hear you first. We want to fight, in this particular case, anti-Semitism online. Then shouldn't we also define it? The IRA definition, the working definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, is the most prominent definition at hand. National parliaments, the European Parliament, the European Council have adopted it. So how can we, use the definition? How can we operationalize it? And should it happen? Then I'll let you start. And then secondly, this question will also go to Michaela.
Of course, as a lawyer, I would almost instinctively want to have a definition, especially if I'm talking about regulation that limits my freedom. And especially if that freedom is free speech, which is foundational. So of course I would want to have a definition. As far as I'm concerned, that definition is very clever. Of course, the balance that it has to strike, we all know, is between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, an extremely complicated and very controversial question. And I'm glad again that I didn't come up with a definition, so I don't have to defend it and explain it, even though I do think that it's one of the best that we have around today. Having said that, as I sort of alluded to before, to me, it's a much greater risk. I mean, gross anti-Semitic statements, it's pretty easy, you know it when you see it. The danger to me is not that. As I alluded to before, dangerous speech is not necessarily illicit speech, but it's much more dangerous. And let me give you an example. Connecting the dots may be very dangerous because it pretends to be an almost scientific exercise, or maybe even investigative journalism, or whatever you wish to call it, which will sort of build up through a series of articles or tweets or posts or whatever, saying maybe this has something to do with that, and so on and so on and so on and so on, not necessarily even articulating one single anti-Semitic statement, but by implication, arriving at a situation where it's much, much more dangerous in terms of brainwashing. It also has to do with repetition. It also has to do with subliminal manipulation. Now, what I just said here goes back to what I said before, which is that to me, it is the psychological element that we should be focusing on much more than a definition, which of course is important, but that is not the dangerous part. And I have to say that I don't know how we can legislate ourselves out of the ability of people to connect the dots and to repeat lies that sort of build up to something in the mind of the beholder and in subliminal ways. But it does still I'm afraid that does still constitute the major and most lethal behavioral impact.
So to summarize then, we need to define it in order to fight the issue. The question is how, and this is where I pass over to you, Michaela.
Yes, not enough. The point I want to make is we need to get psychologists involved in to help us identify the real danger.
So the one issue is that the moment that one of these definitions will be adopted, we need to make a difference between what is legal and what is illegal hate speech. So this is part of a larger discussion. That's why I'd like to turn it over to you, Michaela. How could a platform like Facebook consider these issues and take action?
Yes, I mean, I think that the point that Dan was making about defining certain dangerous, harmful kind of speech I completely agree, is very complex. I do not envy the legislators that would have to do that. As Facebook, obviously, complying with the law is something that we do. So whenever and if we could do it at bigger scale than just national scale, it would be easier considering our operations and how they're structured. So we welcome any attempt from the European institution to clarify the legal framework, harmonize definition and rules. And I mean, Commissioner Jourová Vice President Jourová was talking a little bit about different initiatives that are underway, like the anti-racism action plan and the initiatives that have been announced a couple of days ago as part of the Commission's working plan for 2021 that will include an expansion of the EU list for hate crimes. These are definitely things that help at least paint a picture of the landscape and the legal landscape and helps platform operate in a situation of legal certainty. Now, this being said, as I was also mentioning earlier, and as was mentioned at different moments in the discussion, Facebook as a platform already puts in place voluntary measures to address harmful behaviors or then dangerous speech, like Dan was referring to it. When it comes to anti-Semitism, I mean, we have had multiple discussions with Jewish organizations over the years about the higher definition and how to make the best use of it in pushing forward the Facebook's ability to ensure the safety of Jewish people on the platform. I think that the way that we've approached it is very similar to the way that we approach other definitions that are where there is no overwhelming consensus amongst the different legal systems, is that we've taken this definition as guidance, which has helped us inform our approach and the definition, and has been definitely a point of entry for policy discussions with Jewish communities around the world. We, however, as you know, have not translated the definition into the letter of our policy. And I think this also has something to do with the fact, with what I was mentioning earlier, which is the fact that Facebook has a large number of standards and policies in place. And in order to ensure the safety of Jewish people, we do not only use, for example, our definition of hate speech, which is the one under which we have the ban of harmful stereotypes and Holocaust denial, but there's others like bullying, dangerous organization, etc., which play an important part there.
So thank you for the answer, Michaela. I have been part of various conversations with Facebook, indeed, with regard to how this definition could be adopted, whether it should be adopted, and how it could be operationalized. All I can say is we have the largest Jewish groups coming together to form a campaign, and they clearly state that one of their major claims is the adoption of this definition. So I think that this will be an ongoing discussion that also Facebook and various other platforms will have to face. Okay, so we had the meta entry. We did speak about the definition of the program in order to recognize it. Let's now take a step back with regard to legal framework. Vice President Jourová mentioned the code of conduct that was taken into action in the year of 2016. For those who just joined a bit later, to make it short, the most significant social media platforms back then, Facebook being one of the original signatories, but others joining later, did agree voluntarily to deleting illegal hate speech on their platforms within 24 hours after them being flagged, and reporting that content which was deemed to be well, necessary to be forwarded to eventually take further legal action to the respective institutions and well, you know, to take legal measures. So let's maybe assess on this, since this was the last major piece of legislation. Michaela, can you maybe tell us a bit on how, well, what did this European legislation, very important, there were other national initiatives that were more important, but European legislation, what effect did this have on Facebook's operations? What was their response to it? How did they operationalize it?
Sure. I mean, just as a matter of clarification, this is not legislation. This is a policy initiative. It's, you mentioned that it's a
voluntary agreement, of course.
Voluntary basis. So, and as you rightfully mentioned, Facebook has been a signatory of the Code of Conduct for its very inception in 2016, and it was joined by Instagram, which is also another app in our family of apps that joined the code in 2018. I think our experience with the code has been extremely positive. We've seen continued progress over the years, which have been confirmed by the results of the monitoring exercises, which are carried out every single year by the partner organizations of the Code of Conduct. And Facebook's performance has been increasing over time to reach levels where Vice President Jourová was also mentioning over 90% of, or around 90% of the content flagged is removed within the 24 hours deadline. I would say that we have learned the things that we learned were probably two from the experience. And one is the importance of the collaboration with the trusted partners. And with those, there's, I think, around 38, if I'm not mistaken, civil society organizations which are involved in the Code of Conduct. And over time, we've really been able to establish a relationship with those organizations. Some of those are also, I think, involved in the organizations of today's event, like SEJI. And we're committed to maintain communication with those organizations, to train them on our reporting guidelines so that they're always informed on how to make the best use of the tools that we put at their disposal in order to report content. We give them updates on our policies and how they evolve over time. And also we provide support for their counter speech campaigns, which also play a really, really important part in that. And maybe we can discuss a little bit later around, you know, the importance of the education piece in all of this picture. And then a second bit, I would say very briefly, is that what we realized, and I think that this is a realization that has been not only from the platform's perspective, but also from the perspective of the civil society organizations and the Commission itself, is the difficulty of assessing even illegal hate speech because of the different national approaches to it and what constitutes hate speech or not. So again, just referencing back my point earlier on the fact that a more harmonized approach is something that we would definitely welcome at EU level across the 27 member states.
Well, hopefully this is to be expected with the new Digital Services Act coming into place. As Michaela rightfully put out, of course, the Code of Conduct was not a piece of legislation. It was a voluntary agreement. And then this is why you, again, being the expert here, we'd be interested in, from your perspective, how would you evaluate it? Does it make sense to have voluntary agreements with such platforms? Do you think that a more legal framework is necessary? What is your assessment?
Okay, well, first of all, let me just remind you all that we have two major theoretical legal systems. We have the US, the Communications Decency Act, which provides complete immunity to platforms under the philosophy that they don't generate the content themselves. They're simply platforms for third-party generated content. And then we have the European approach, the e-commerce directive from year 2000, which will probably be replaced by the directive that you mentioned, which will probably take effect. It was supposed to take effect by the end of the year, maybe only next year because of COVID. But anyway, the Digital Services Act is more or less around the corner. And that legal framework in Europe is based on what I call relative immunity, which means that under certain conditions, platforms may be accountable for content generated by third parties. The main difference is the knowledge standard. And this is really an answer to your question, because the voluntary agreement is of course not enforceable, and it will unfortunately not give any satisfaction to victims, direct victims or indirect victims. It's simply a choice that platforms are making, it's completely, it's what we call soft law, and sometimes soft law may turn into hard law before the courts, but I haven't seen that yet in terms of speech regulation. So I would go for regulation in the sense of legal regulation, but the main question I have to ask myself here is, and ask everybody is, on what basis would I hold the platforms accountable? Let's say that we have solved the definition problem. And again, to me, the definition problem is not the real problem. The real problem is the behavioral problem. And that one is much more complicated than the definition problem. Okay, now, on what basis would I hold them accountable? Would it be on the basis of complicity? It's very interesting because that's, of course, the almost intuitive answer that a lawyer or anybody else would give, for that matter, would say that the platforms are complicit in disseminating hurtful content, and that they're therefore complicit in the hurtful acts being the consequence of such hurtful content. But complicity is an extremely dangerous legal notion. It really ends nowhere. At the end of the day, we are all complicit. It's an extremely dangerous notion, especially when we talk about free speech. There is also another platform which is called vicarious liability or contributory infringement, which we especially see in intellectual property infringement, which is actually very interesting. The intellectual property infringements are being policed and enforced much more on social media than attacks on Jews and on other religions. And you may just ask yourself, why more protection to copyright protected material than to human beings? That's a very interesting question. So anyway, that is protected by what we call vicarious liability. But all of these platforms or all of these theories of indirect liability have advantages, and they have very, very, very strong disadvantages. I'd say, just as a closing remark here, that I mentioned before, we're going back in history, and actually nothing is new under the sun. And I mentioned the debate that we had on TV and that we had with video games, whether violence in video games would lead to violence in real life. We also had some cases in the 70s, and some of you may remember them, those of you who were born by then, which dealt with copyright violations, especially of movies and of the music industry. And of course, that had to do with Betamax and VHS technology introduced on the market by Sony. I mean, in those days, the sky was falling down. There were numerous court cases whether such technology was in itself an infringement of copyrights. There was a Supreme Court case that finally decided that that was not the case, because the technology was a so-called stable technology, which means that it was not in itself hurtful. It was the use of it that in some particular cases might lead to unlawful copying and copyright infringements, not just for personal use. And it's the same thing that we have here 20 or 30 and 40 years later with this new technology. It is a stable technology. In other words, it is the use of the technology and not the technology per se that is inherently and potentially dangerous. So how do we define the abusive use of that technology as somehow engaging the responsibility of the technology owner? That's the real challenge. And I don't believe that
and Dan, that is a perfect transition. Thank you very much for making that point, because this is a perfect transition to the next question that I would then like to ask to the two of you, actually. So we have covered the issue from a legal perspective. We did speak about these social implications. we do know what the Jewish community here rightfully claims. Let's face it, in this entire debate, there is an imbalance of power because it also is a very technical issue. Michaela, I'm constantly checking the numbers that Facebook is publishing. And just today I wrote that you mentioned that there is a difference between the proactive detection of hate speech and the reactive fighting of hate speech. Facebook itself mentions that 95% of illegal hate speech on its platforms is being detected proactively. So you do have strong algorithms. And let me also again emphasize that these algorithms compared to other smaller platforms are much, much more elaborate. But at the same time, it's very hard to, see what's behind these numbers. I myself am running a project here in Berlin with the Alfred Landecker Foundation that uses artificial intelligence to detect hate speech. And I can tell you, it's not that easy. Yeah, it really, really is not, especially if you don't have an insight into the algorithms behind it. So to make it short, Michaela, both with regard to algorithmic transparency and how these algorithms are working, but then also with regard to how the data collected could be, for example, used for scientific reasons. Could you share maybe a few concrete examples on how Facebook can improve on this matter or what they are currently doing?
Yes, I mean, I think with regards to how the algorithm works, I think that a very high level is that we use a mix of artificial intelligence and no, that's not the question. I don't know.
Sorry, I mean, very important. You do not need to obviously explain how the algorithm works, but rather how more people can understand how it works. But please go forward.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wouldn't attempt at explaining in details how algorithm works because I'm not a technical person. I'm a public affairs professional. So for me, that's kind of like a very mysterious ways as well. But I mean, I think with regards to, let's just jump to algorithmic transparency then. I think that when it comes to transparency, there is, I would like to first highlight one element, which is that we need to be very careful when we ask for more transparency of those systems. And the reason is that there is a level beyond which being transparent on how certain systems work risks empowering abusers and offenders to game the system. So giving users, including the abusers, the opportunity to understand in depth how algorithm works really risks create a situation where basically our offenders are given an extra edge on how to bypass our
absolutely rules. Absolutely, but maybe to make it a bit more concrete, this number, a pre-detection rate of 95%. How can we understand whether this is true or not? How can we get a better understanding of how this system works and whether it really functions or not?
So I think that so the number that you're quoting is first of all part of one of our transparency efforts, which is the regular publication of enforcement reports on the numbers of content removed and actioned, and how that is done, which is in our community standards enforcement report. And what we do is that we break down per category. Each policy is represented in the community. Well, not each. I think that now we are around a little over 10 for both Facebook and Instagram, and we explain how much content is taken down as a consequence of reports received from users and as proactively detected. We have audits in place. We have oversight on what we do. Is something that we are developing, and in order to allow also to have a third-party authority confirm it's already in place, and I think you mentioned that as well, Ben. In general, I think like there is another interesting aspect of that, which is that it's around how we recommend content to people. I think it could be interesting to maybe share something around that, because one of the features of Facebook across our apps is the fact that we make recommendations to help users discover new communities or content that we think that it could be interesting for that. So what we do is that we personalize basically the experience and these recommendations in order to make sure that they're relevant and valuable to the person that they are targeted to. We have guidelines on how these recommendations, which are done in an automatic fashion, are how those decisions are taken. We are also transparent about that. We started in this year, actually earlier in August, we published our recommendation guidelines so that it's clear how they work. And just to give you some examples, what we try to do with these guidelines is that we try to avoid making recommendations of content that can be low quality, objectionable, or particularly sensitive. We also pay particular attention to content that is not appropriate for younger viewers, for example. We design those guidelines.
And by the way, and there you have significant success. I mean, both with regard to the detection of terroristic content, but also nudity. There's collaboration between the platforms. Things can be taken down within seconds. I mean, this is impressive. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you again. But please also, because with regard to time, we have another 10 minutes left, and there's one more question. So also, Dan, I will have to be a bit more strict with you on time.
I know. So I will just maybe wrap it up just to say we believe in the value of being transparent. We try to be transparent. We try to have oversight over certain transparency efforts like the Community Standards Enforcement Report, and we are open to discussing more and how to open our systems in a way that still allows us to safeguard the integrity of those and still not provide unnecessary support to the abusers.
Absolutely. And yet again, one of the projects that I'm working on aims to fill this power gap in order to add a more technical approach to combating legal and illegal hate speech online by providing additional data. So maybe this will also serve as an example for our very last question. Then I give you the floor with regard to this question before we come to our last. Technical approaches, algorithmic transparency. You mentioned it before. What has to happen across all platforms?
Well, I think that one of the main, you may call it technical or whatever you wish to call it, it's not really very important. One of the main features that Facebook should really consider seriously adopting now is revising its policy on anonymity. I would like very much to hear what Michaela has to say about that. That has to do, of course, with the disinhibition effect, again, a psychological phenomenon of if you are anonymous, unfortunately, you say a lot of stuff you wouldn't say if you knew that you would have to face the consequences because people could find you. It's not very clear to me what Facebook's policy is on this. Sometimes I hear that they don't allow you to open accounts anonymously. Sometimes I hear that they do. The debate in France right now, of course, as a consequence of the horrible events that we had last year, is that Facebook should be under an obligation to, from a technical point of view, secure identifying data, and not just IP addresses, which they should share with law enforcement, by the way, but also identifying data from a technical point of view, and so that everybody knows that when he or she is posting whatever it is, hate speech or anything else, it is under his or her name. And that responsibility and that accountability as an author, I think will help a lot. So that's the first thing that I would say from a technical point of view should be ensured. The second thing is that you mentioned Instagram, which is part of the Facebook family. I would also mention WhatsApp. WhatsApp, which for better or for worse now allows you to communicate in an encrypted manner. To what extent should, from a technical point of view, such encryption be decrypted when it comes to communication of an incitement like manner. I use the word incitement because you used the word attacks. And I thought that was very interesting, because the problem with the definition or the community guidelines, the way I understand you described them, Michaela, is precisely that you introduced that word that it would attack someone. That, of course, is very much influenced by the US Supreme Court case law on free speech, which today employs the imminent lawless action criterion. And before that, it was the so-called clear and present danger. I subscribe to the clear and present danger, which includes the psychological element. It does not need to include, from a legal point of view, an element of direct attack. As I mentioned before, the implicit attack may be much worse than the direct attack. So from a technical point of view, you would need, I would recommend that, to revisit that term and to devise your pro-detection algorithm in such a way that is much more based on the clear and present danger than on the imminent risk. And you should also, in my opinion, from a technical point of view, ensure that nobody is anonymous. Why should they be? And you should also, from my point of view, ensure decryption of WhatsApp if that is necessary for law enforcement reasons.
So maybe, Ben, I could jump in.
So here's the thing. You have, if you do so, you have 30 seconds. I cut you 3 times, so I have to give you that time. But then please try to stay short, okay?
I'll try to be super short. So on authentic expression of themselves, well, of authenticity, I would like to say that Facebook has a real name policy. So it actually requires users to use their real name. And if we have suspicion that that is not the case, we would take it down, because we understand the importance of people using their own their names for other users to feel safe about the interaction and who they're dealing with. And then just very briefly on WhatsApp and on encryption, obviously there is a big debate, but what I would just like to add is that for us, encryption is really important. One of the things that matter to us is not only the safety of our users, but also their privacy, and building backdoors to provide access to encrypted spaces actually risks really significantly weakening the security of the spaces. So there's a lot.
And you'd eventually use users to Telegram, which we haven't even spoken about today. So okay, let me maybe. So first of all, thank you, really, the two of you. And as I said from the beginning on, none of us would be seated here if this issue wasn't dear to us. I am in the luxurious position of not only being able to listen to what you're saying, but also to being, let's say, the third party spectator. And what I feel is happening very often in these kind of debates is that in the end of the day, we talk around the bush, in the sense that we understand that there is an issue, we know that it has to be solved, but there is not the one clear thing that people should be taken out. So what I'd like to do in order to conclude this debate is to give the two of you the floor. Each of you will get, let's say, 30 seconds. So the idea really is to have concluding remarks. You're addressing a group of civil society organizations after all, okay? So what can be done on the side of civil societies? And you remember this was the last question that I also asked to Vice President Jourová. What role could civil society maybe play when it comes to combating hate speech online, when it comes to combating anti-Semitism online? Dan, I will give you the floor first.
Well, I think the obvious answer is to be very active on the flagging of notices activity, which now is fairly easy on Facebook. I must say it's pretty nightmarish on Twitter. I've tried it. As I mentioned before this started, I usually don't speak of people that are not here to defend themselves, but you allowed me to do it. So I will mention that flagging posts on Twitter is a very tedious exercise. It's much more easy now on Facebook, and I congratulate them for that. And of course, we should, all the users, take part in that. I do not believe that initiatives of boycotts, as we've seen in terms of hate speech from the advertising industry and from users, take us anywhere. That was a very short-lived initiative. The importance of Facebook as an advertising retargeting machine is so strong that won't take us anywhere. We need positive civil action, not negative.
That was exactly 30 seconds, Dan, which I'm extremely thankful for. Michaela, civil society, partnerships, what should be the role? Please, your 30 seconds.
I feel a lot of pressure since Dan was so precise on time, but I think there's 3 points, and some are repetition of what he said. One is definitely continue reporting content. Reporting content helps our systems get better, helps us understand better the patterns of behaviors on the platform and help inform our policies. Second, the education. I mentioned it a little bit earlier. It's a pity that we didn't get to go a little bit more in detail, but I see a very important role for civil society organization in raising awareness, educating people to not only push for positive narratives online, but also to empower people to be more resilient of the pressure. And then finally, I think I already said it, counter speech, very important to push positive narratives online. So it's 3, but maybe 2.5 and 30 seconds, I believe.
Almost. Folks, thank you so very much for such a substantive conversation today. We do appreciate your presence, and we also take it as a signal of your continued engagement when it comes to tackling anti-Semitism and hate online. However, we seem to all agree on the fact that a lot has to be done. And this is why, again, concluding this debate, I want to again highlight the campaign Deleting Anti-Semitism. Delete Anti-Semitism, I'm sorry. DeleteAntisemitism.org is the website that you should look at. Please take a look at their policy recommendations. And for those still watching, I also want to highlight again, there is a significant piece of legislation being drafted. It will affect all of us in the coming years. So also stay tuned there, stay alerted, because it will take an immediate effect on our everyday life. The very last thing that I'd like to say, apart from again, thanking both of you for your inputs, on behalf of the organizations that were involved, being the American Jewish Committee, Transatlantic Institute, Bnei Brit Europe, Bnei Brit International, SEGI, a Jewish contribution to an inclusive Europe, the European Jewish Congress, the European Union of Jewish Students, the World Jewish Congress. I want to thank you on behalf of all of these organizations for tuning in, for staying alerted, and for trying to take part in this significant debate. To all of these organizations, obviously also thank you for bringing me personally back to Brussels. Stay healthy, everyone. Stay alerted, and please stay involved. Thank you very much for tuning in.